Welcome to episode 64 of the Filmumentaries podcast. This is Jamie Benning talking to you from my pit. Actually, looking around, it's quite tidy for our little office today. Bloody cold, but tidy at least. Thanks for joining me again, or maybe for the first time. If you're a returning listener, you know what's ahead here. And if you're new, you have about an hour of movie history conversation ahead of you. Thanks for all the nice comments about episode 63, in which I spoke with ILM VFX legend Dennis Muren. Really did enjoy that chat, and I'm glad you did too. Just a quick note on our documentary project, Not Your Average Joe, that's currently on Kickstarter. It's about the life and career of Jaws and Close Encounters and so many other movies. Production designer Joe Alves, who worked in Hollywood for 4 decades and rubbed shoulders with just about everyone, including Paul Newman and Elvis Presley, and of course worked for Spielberg and Carpenter, amongst many others, including Alfred Hitchcock and Walt Disney. Who knew? After an amazing first day, we are lagging behind our target a bit, and I'd really appreciate your support in allowing us to honour this great man. Even if you aren't in a position to help financially, please just share the tweets and posts on Facebook and Instagram. Every like, every comment and every share does make a difference. Unless you have a marketing budget of around 50 grand, you can't really get anywhere with just posting into the void. So I need you to share and like and comment and all of that stuff. You can find me on @JamieSWB on Twitter, @JoeAlvesDoc on Instagram, and on Filmumentaries on Facebook. Back to the matter of this episode. I like to hear differing points of view from people. In my case, the memories of people who worked on the same movies. I like to dig deeper than the accepted version of events. Things that have become mythologized in making-ofs and articles over the years. The more breadth I can find in the narratives I record, the more interesting it becomes, to me anyway, and hopefully to you. Now, you may recognize Steve Williams' story if you've seen, and I hate to say it because I dislike this show with strong feelings, the movies that made us. Yes, Steve is the guy that made the CG T-Rex skeleton against the wishes of his superiors and made sure it was seen by producer Kathleen Kennedy in the pre-production days on Jurassic Park. This series of events changed the movie industry forever, and you may say that this could have been any number of VFX artists, and who knows how close other artists may have been to making a similar breakthrough, but this is firmly in the history of Steve Williams himself. He was that guy. Scott Lieberich has directed Jurassic Punk, a feature-length documentary all about Steve, warts and all. And just a couple of weeks ago, I emailed Steve after a kind friend sent his email address over, and almost immediately Steve called me on the phone. He was great to talk to, very fun, very smart. We talked about UK sitcoms, his nan's favourite tea, she's British as well, like me, the fact that he played rugby and that he travelled quite extensively, even to my hometown. He knew where I lived. But he also carries the burden of this story. The documentary is very open and very honest about Steve's issues with alcohol, his tempestuous career, and seeks to shed more light on his impact on the VFX business. There are a few swears in this conversation, and I also wanted to point out that Steve misunderstood one of my questions to Scott about showing his early documentary cuts to friends. I was saying that friends will always give you nice feedback, and it's not until you get an audience that you really know where you are. And Steve kind of misconstrued this as saying that it was just his friends talking about him in the documentary. That's not what I meant. Anyway, regardless of that, I did have fun chatting with both these gentlemen. So here's my conversation with Steve Williams, VFX artist, and Scott Lieberich, the director of Jurassic Punk. And I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on.
I don't know that anybody else could have modeled those dinosaurs. I don't know that anybody else could have set the standards for animating them. I don't know that we would have even tried.
Here's somebody that was fundamental at that time in the progress of this disruptive technology.
Steve Williams, otherwise known as Spaz Williams, worked in a tiny windowless room that was called the Pit.
Lucasfilm's Industrial Light and Magic. This was where Spaz and his cohorts created breakthrough animation.
He happened to be the right guy at the right time, at the right place. Before Steve, this stuff couldn't have been done.
It was not biotechnology that brought the dinosaurs to life in Jurassic Park.
Animator Steve Williams used a computer to bring the T-Rex to life.
For almost 75 years, the technology and the techniques were pretty much the same.
3 key projects ultimately had the greatest impact: The Abyss, Terminator 2, Jurassic Park.
If you want to stay in the industry, you got to play the game. Steve didn't play that game.
The parties, far out of control.
I was suspended twice.
He was a rebel.
Steve said, why don't we just build all the dinosaurs in computer graphics?
He knew the time was right. And I think other people was like, whoa, no, we're not going into this whole new realm.
I just believed we could do it. But actually having to prove it, that was the challenge. There was a lot of people pissed off at me because of my arrogance. I shot my mouth off a lot.
This is unfortunately what's happening.
I'm not political. I'm not political. I've never been political, right? I'm not good at it.
Scott, set the scene for us about the making of this movie. How did it come about? How long have you known Steve? Why did you come up with this idea, and how did you come up with this idea to make this documentary?
Well, I was an intern at Industrial Light and Magic in 1994, and it was at that time that I really learned about Steve. I didn't really read much or know much about him in the regular news publications or computer graphics. I mean, there wasn't really computer graphics magazines back then. It was just special effects magazines like Cinefex. So I didn't really see much of him in those publications, or even a lot of the behind the scenes things, shows until later. But when I started at ILM as an intern, I met him, and of course he's kind of infamous. And at that time he was infamous. And so I realized at that point that there was sort of a whole story of maybe what went on behind the scenes on some of these incredibly influential films that, changed the world and changed movies that just kind of wasn't maybe being told to the public. And as an intern, I was surprised to hear a lot of these stories because it was all internal. So at that point, I knew I wanted to make a movie someday, or tell the story someday about the digital transition that occurred between 1988 and 1993, and sort of let the whole world know what I knew. And so that was originally what I wanted to make, was just a film that kind of talked about the digital revolution and the digital transition that occurred. But then as I started making the film, I realized I really wanted to make it about a singular person, and that was Steve.
Mm-hmm. And Steve, how did Scott approach you with this idea?
Well, we've been talking for years about stuff, because I would just regale these crazy stories, right, about kind of thing. And so, he just started coming down, and one time, I think, as a gift kind of thing, he kind of filmed me, and I was just messing around and telling stupid stories off color. He came down to my place at a ranch in Northern California, and then he put together this 20, and it was really good, and I thought, wow, how flattering. Not only is it nice, but also describes. See, the thing at ILM, there's sort of this Ponzi hierarchy, right? And so they had the Ministry of Revisionist History there, right? So it was quite obvious that you were kept in a certain, in the basement, in the trenches, especially when you came up with the ideas. And so I think that he became interested in that because like the Abyss and Terminator, of which I built, with Mark, but I was the head animator and head modeler on it. Like, I was still trying to figure out what John Knoll did on the Abyss, and to this day. And I mean, we literally are in a room having to explain rendering to him in '88, me and Mark. I mean, that's the way the hierarchy worked there. And then it was really with Jurassic, where I thought, you know what, I'm going to make sure they know who did the work. So that's why I ambushed them. So I think that those stories and us getting suspended and sort of the shenanigans that went on at that time made for a very interesting or compelling story, where it showed not just the fluff on the outside of how these things get to the screen, it actually shows underneath the hood. Mm. And so that's why I said, if you're going to do a documentary, you're going to look at all the good and all the bad, because there's nothing better than I sort of prided myself on honesty when it came to those things without spinning the story at all. So I thought, if you want to see the good, you're going to see the bad too, Scott, because I was going through a terrible divorce and I had fallen into a pretty bad hole, so. Yeah. And I thought, there's nothing more honest than allowing that. And we knew each other well enough, and I loved his drawing, and so that's why I grabbed Scotty out of the art department, because he was a great cartoonist. I mean, he not only did the whole film, he did the poster, I mean, it's crazy.
Independent filmmaking, you do everything.
And then filmmaking, and then and he was the right guy to do it because he got it. He understood, and I thought, well, if they want to do something on that's very flattering and very nice, I didn't think it'd be this professional and well put together.
Well, and originally when I first started filming Steve, I wasn't intending to make a film about Steve Williams. I just wanted to explore that whole, basically all the back stories and the sort of stories that were in the internal culture of ILM at the time, but weren't really outside in the media. And so that's what I was really interested in, was telling some of those stories and telling a story about people, not so much process, but about the people involved and the personalities and the conflicts. And I think that never really gets talked about much when you think of DVD extras or making of shorts or anything that you see about the industry and about the world of visual effects. It's always just about like, how did they do it? Well, they did this, did that. And I'm just like, I want to know more about the people and like what were the challenges for the people and for the personalities.
You get a real sense of that in the film as well. Like, it feels personal, Steve. Like, you've clearly opened up and been willing to let this go sort of deep into your life and your the issues you've had and the challenges you've had. I can't remember ever seeing a movie related documentary told with such honesty before.
That's exactly where I allowed for it, James, because I kind of had this policy that there had been so much. It was the antithesis of the emperor isn't wearing any clothes. In other words, there's such a fallacy in terms of protecting this hierarchy. I thought, there was too many times I was defending artists that could not defend themselves from the beating that they got from managers. I thought, you want to pick on someone, pick on me. So that became sort of a target. In addition, that I was kind of personally responsible for those innovations. I mean, it was the first animator they ever hired there that actually knew computers and knew alias software from the mid 80s. And I didn't like the theft, and the notion. And I always considered the process of like the trophy was the process of going through it, not some gold statue that sits on your mantelpiece, of which there wasn't one at ILM. An individual took it home that represent 30 or 40 people for divorces and 70-hour weeks and everything. I thought, this is a tragedy in a way. So I figured that Scott had the wherewithal, and he also had the tool set, in terms of a filmmaker, to tell the truth. I said, if he's going to tell the truth, I'm not hiding anything. You know?
And Steve was going through a bad time, and he was going through a divorce, and I knew a lot of his sadness and grief at that moment in his life was just that divorce was just, to me, what I saw was that divorce was just the tip of the iceberg in terms of a whole lifetime of sort of.
It was also the bad modus operandi. It was also the bad magnum opus as well. In other words, I'd gone through a hard time with the visual effects community and feeling a little bit of slighted by it. And then the only thing I really had left was my marriage, and that blew up. It was just a bad cacophony of things that were going on.
In terms of the sort of reputation you have within the industry, how did you have any concerns about, in making the film, of burning any more bridges, or are the bridges already burned?
To me, there had to be a purity about it. And, I tried very hard, when I told Kathleen, I said, I never set out to hurt anyone. I never did. Right. But taking enough torpedoes to the side where you're essentially held back, even though you're the one that came up with the innovations when you were told not to bother trying, and the same people that got the awards for your innovations were the ones that denied it.
What do you think it was about the industry, though? And I mean, I briefly dipped into the film industry myself. I worked for a company that provided editing solutions, still when there were Steenbecks and Chems, but Lightworks and Avid was coming in. And I'd come from TV, and I was amazed at how antiquated the industry was and how kind of immovable it was, and how nobody wanted to kind of change the status quo. What were those barriers that you came up against, and how did you manage to kind of navigate your way around them?
Well, being kind of a thinker and, always working with my hands and everything like that, I was always driven by how things work. So that was sort of a prime, motivating factor for me, number one. The other thing that I ran into is that there was such a protection of convention and standard. right? And I always felt, well, if you don't know what's behind the door kind of thing, I mean, how will you ever find out unless you don't open it, whether or not you make a mistake at it or not? But even in the world of animation, what we throw out compared to what we're stuck with, those processes, you have to go through a distillation process. So I always sort of had a policy in the world of computer graphics, getting into it in the late 70s. I just said, these are, the human eye sees 10 million colors. We calculate 17.6 million colors, right? So images on a screen are nothing but a bathtub full of color ball bearings. It is inevitable. And pixels have no conscience. I said, it's inevitable that anything is possible visually. Now, that was objected to by guys like Mirren, who used to literally tell me to my face that computer-generated humans and stunt doubles and creatures will never happen, ironically. And I have no issue saying that because it's the damn truth, and I don't care. It doesn't bother me, and this is kind of like, this is not a crusader for the little guy in the trench, right? But I know what I ran into. Right. And I know now we have a situation, especially with the production facilities and studios, where this has become a major problem, and the seed of those types of problems were rearing their head 30 years ago, when we're dealing with one film, as opposed to all studios dealing with, it's still the same problems, people going through divorces and killing themselves and then basically getting fired off of production when the production's over. And there doesn't seem to be taking care of the artists that get them there. Right. It's really just this sort of Illuminati club, right, that only seem to benefit from it. And I don't like Ponce, right? Me being Canadian, right? I understand what class system is, I witnessed it. And one of the reasons that I got out of Toronto is because, well, you can't do this. I mean, this has never been thought of before. And I said, it's like Trudeau said, the prime minister at the time, if you don't like it here and it's not working for you, go somewhere else. So I did. And the attitude at ILM was very much like a research laboratory. And really, the guy that helped me sort of legitimize my thinking was a guy like Mark Depay, right? Who wasn't really an artist himself. He was an engineer, coder, but he made it okay to have these crazy ideas. It's essentially like a cheerleader, and then it became kind of a novelty to sort of fight against the system because everyone thought you were wrong.
But what do you think it was about? Did those guys feel threatened by what you had to offer? Is that ultimately, was it born out of insecurity, do you think?
I believe so, because none of them could draw and none of them were really artists. They were sort of technical people. In other words, if you look at a company like Pixar in retrospect, or Disney, right? It was Disney animation, Pixar animation. So it was the craft before the tool, whereas it was this digital. And so they were more enamored with the pencil and controlling what that pencil was, as opposed to the necessary craft in order to make it sing. And so I knew I was different. Yes, I did have the technical math skills, but I was a drawer, and an artist, and I understood how to build stuff. And just so happens I understood how to build stuff in data as well. And I think that became a threat because I was never, they said that, I was never political, and I never really was compelled at all by ladder climbing or anything. I always promoted the fact that what I walked in there was an animator. How I walked out 10 years later when Jim Morse fired me at the will of Dennis Mirren, I was still an animator. After I'd won these guys, after they had all their retirement homes set up in Hawaii,
Yeah. And Steve, Scott, sorry, well, you were, you've been interested in this subject before. You made the short Life After Pi, which is about Rhythm and Hughes Studio, winning the Oscar and then kind of folding almost immediately afterwards. And it brought the crisis of the effects industry to the fore for the first time, for me anyway. It's the first time I realized that. Do you see this film, Jurassic Punk, as a kind of next step in kind of bringing that story forward and making more and more people aware of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jurassic Punk is a specific story about a specific artist's experience in the industry. But I think it is kind of universal in a way, even beyond the effects industry. I think industries have stories like Steve's, and have Steve's in their history. But I do think that there is something that people can take home from the movie in regards to how do you say acknowledge the work when there's so many people doing the work, and then how do you acknowledge the work when there is a few individuals or even one sometimes on those big teams that is actually the person driving things forward, but isn't hierarchical position yet to get the acknowledgement and get the accolades and get the rewards, be it monetary or public. And until they get to that hierarchical place in the company, they're not gonna get it, even though they're doing the innovations and doing the work to get them there. It's just a strange problem with all corporations, in that the thing that maybe makes everyone rich and famous isn't going to make you rich and famous. You don't get that till later. Is strange to me. It's like, why is it that maybe the people who are in the trenches, or the people who are in those meetings, really changing the course of productions based on their hard work, are for some reason just on a big list of people in the end, and aren't on that stage accepting those awards, or aren't getting those big bonuses or those percentages of the films that make a lot of money. So.
And how early on, Steve, were you kind of aware that you had to kind of compromise the chance to climb the ladder in favor of the artistry? Because it strikes me that you've got two choices in big companies like this, where you either stick to the artistry and you compromise climbing the ladder and earning your fortune, or you go in the opposite direction and you lose the artistry.
I'm sorry, Jamie. Yeah, that's exactly what I did. Is that I saw it as being completely vapid and hollow, right? Because I didn't dress like them. I smelled like oil. Okay. I was working on mechanics all the time. I was taking guns apart, engines apart, drawing, creating, and it was very creative time. But, I didn't drive the Lexus car, and, I didn't fit into that, and I'd be invited, Jim would invite me to the visual effects supervisor's lunch. And I said, well, what do you guys talk about there? And he goes, oh no, that's very important. We talk about the future. I said, Jim, not one innovation has ever come out from those Ponzi expensive, where everyone's wearing expensive shirts. They come out of the trenches where I dwell in and where I trust only. Right. And I still stand on it, and I think that really rubbed them the wrong way, because I was not, quote unquote, a team player, but I did not consider them worth a team joining at all. And that was just not me, and I suppose it had something to do with maybe the upbringing, sort of witnessing the class, the Mrs. Bouquets of life, kind of that. Yeah.
I'm loving all these British comedy references.
Oh, well, because I live by them. I still live by them. They're so brilliant still to this day, right? Anyways, I won't get into that because that's just...
You talk about in the very top of the documentary about, you say this line about my memories haunt me. My memory is my problem, because, you've got these memories and you wish you didn't have them. Did you find making the film and seeing the film in its final finished form cathartic in any way? Did it exercise some of the ghosts?
It is not really exercising, but it is cathartic. I found one of the most powerful weapons I have is my memory. I really don't forget very much. And that's not like he did me wrong. I'm not vindictive like that at all. Right. I just let my work do the talking, for me. But, it's tough. It's tough to watch the fall. Like that's a side of part of life. I was losing everything I built. I spent 25 years building a ranch myself with my own hands, and I was forcibly had to get rid of it. So it's tough to see that, and just tough to see the old place, because I thought I'd be taken out of there in a pine box. And it brings up, kind of like, what the hell happened? Like, how did I, get to the top of the ladder, but yet at the same time, they get mad at me, and and I'm not even talked about, and then they stick in some fella, who allegedly is responsible for these things, but he can't, to this day, can't explain how it was done. I thought, this is such a tragedy. And I didn't want to blame the American system or anything, because it exists that way in Canada, like it does in any colonial country. Right. But as like Scott said, this is not a unique story to this industry. It happens to be very visual, or very sort of current right now, because of the magnitude of the films and the fact that, yes, when I wrote 45 years ago, you will have the resurrection of deceased actors. Okay. You will have actors that don't exist. And everyone thought I was crazy when I said that. I said, well, Edward Mitchell in 1870 wrote a book called The Man Without a Body. And it was the first time that the term teleportation was ever used. The concept of moving your awareness from one platform to another. So it's not, and even the ancient Greeks had the same concept as well. So it's not a unique concept. So to me, I just looked at the patterns of the past, and it was easy to calculate the future because pixels on a screen were nothing but a blueprint for the inevitable. The fact that humans are enamored with trying to replicate themselves synthetically because they want to hoard longevity like we hoard everything. So to me, these little equations were very simple to sort of stand by as being the inevitable truth. And I knew I was right. I knew Murin was wrong. Right. And when he would tell me,
that you could, on paper, if people heard that you were criticizing Murin, right? Like if they're listening to this now, how can you criticize Dennis? He's won, more Oscars than anyone and all this kind of stuff. But in the film, Scott, you use a lot of archive footage, and there are snippets of Dennis admitting and holding his hands up that he didn't understand computer graphics and he went away for a year or 2 years or whatever it was, took that kind of sabbatical. Oh, here comes your cat down the stairs, or dog. What is that?
It's a cat without a tail.
Oh, right.
Everything in my life is mutation, even my cat.
But I was saying you use that archive footage in the film to tell the story. How difficult was it to find some of those clips? And were there any that you kind of chanced upon where you thought, yes, this is exactly what I need to get this point across that Steve's making?
Well, a lot of the archival material you see in the film is stuff that's just readily available on YouTube. And there's also just ways that you, as a filmmaker like myself, you use clips like that so that they are fair use and that permission isn't really necessary. And that was one of the biggest challenges of the film, was just because I knew this was going to be an archival heavy film. And so I had to educate myself a lot about those fair use laws and hire special fair use attorneys to help me with that. But yeah, in terms of Dennis is always sort of in the press said, this was all very much a surprise to him in terms of the capability that he was seeing guys like Steve and Mark and everyone bringing to the table. And it makes total sense. I think he saw that it was powerful. But I don't think that, because of the speed of the technology and because of the fact that he was so busy with so many other films that he was making using traditional effects, and that was his toolbox. I think that he was always smart about saying, computer graphics could really change things, but it wasn't like he ever claimed that he, knew how to get on a computer and make computer graphics like he could with the traditional tools.
But the thing is, and again, Jamie, this is not an attempt to beat up Murin so much, right? And I know, Scotty, we want him to be in the documentary, just like Phil. And Phil was deathly honest and had sort of an epiphany, I think. And even the way that he carried himself was very honest. And finally, he just realized, but those guys were not happy with me because I completely steered that ship. So I don't want to give the illusion that these guys accepted what I was doing. They were pissed off, right? And I was there, I saw it. I was told that I was committing political suicide by pushing forth with doing this by the same guys that got the award. And so to me, I considered that a tragedy, right? But Scotty did attempt to get Dennis to interview for this documentary many, many times, and there was always some excuse. And so people say, well, we don't hear his story. Well, he wouldn't tell it. So, unless it was under the protection of the ILM, publicity machine. We've had people from the visual effects magazine say, they're talking about Terminator, they're talking about these films. So where's a picture, Steve? And so they said, they did not provide us pictures of you, right? Because all the publicity shots were taken of this fake setup with, Murin with his hand on a keyboard or a mouse, which is just a load of crap,
I think too, the political suicide stuff is I think that was Dennis. I think the way that you told me that story, Steve, is that was the moment of him, because you were in the press saying, hey, I was told not to do this and I did it anyway. That was when Murin pulled you aside and said, hey, what are you doing? Why are you saying this publicly? This is political suicide. So to me, like stories like that gets me thinking that it's like, yeah, like it was what got Steve, what made, Steve says, oh, they hated me. I think what made them mad was that he wasn't playing the game. He wasn't, accepting his fate. He wasn't saying like, they can have the award, they can have this. I'm not going to tell everybody that they didn't want me to do this stuff. He went out and told everyone that would listen. And so like, to me, like he's a completely different kind of person than most in the effects.
Scotty, you're partially right about that, because the thing is that I did not do it in spite. I did it because if I did not rebel against that situation, you wouldn't have had those types of films. If I played the game,
well, exactly,
we wouldn't have advanced where we were. And I had this idea, as did Mark, right? And the part that I didn't expect, right, is I was going to have the shit beat out of me by these guys saying, hey, you're not playing the game. No. You don't have the car. You don't have the clothes. You don't look that way. You have to go to these Ponzi meetings and stuff and crap. And I said, listen, I go back to, I said, had I followed those rules, we wouldn't have had those advances as quickly as we did. Right. And I knew that you had to basically really, break a few rules. And where I got in trouble with Murin is when I started talking about digital humans. And that's when he told me that I was committing political suicide. Right.
There's that great clip in the film where there's somebody who represents several actors' estates, and he's saying he'll sue you to the ends of the earth, basically.
That was, and Scott didn't include it, but I got in a tete-a-tete with that guy, and I said, well, do you think that Bugs Bunny, as an example, okay, is sued by the estates of Harpo Marx and Jack Benny? Because all the animators openly admit that he's a concatenation of the two personalities. And then his response was, I don't know, I don't represent them. Right. So the thing is that when you're looking at screen manifestation, like Tom Cruise got up and got in a big argument with Mark and I once when we were working on Death Becomes Her. And he goes, hold on, when I give a performance, it's unique. And now we jump ahead to Indiana Jones 5, where they're replacing his face with data. Okay. So it's not film anymore, realistically, is it? And I said, yes, but you're recording into a medium that used to be like a chisel and carving in granite. I said, now it is like the paint never dries. It's like an Etch-a-Sketch. So we could put your head on Goldie Hawn's body right now. Right. And that concept was just a mind blower to everybody back in, the early 90s.
You mentioned that it's standard now, but when did you realize that you kind of created this monster, as it were? I was talking to somebody last night. I was at the BFI here. There was a movie night thing on, and I was chatting to somebody who's a producer, and I mentioned that I was interviewing you, and I told your kind of story in short form. She said, oh, it's his fault, is it? So when
his fault. Well, that's the joke we make. It's my fault.
Yeah.
Right. And I have to tell you, Jamie, when Jurassic came out, everyone's going, this is so great. And I got in trouble with Janet Healy. She took me aside and yelled at me because I said, you're looking at the beginning of the end of filmmaking. That's what I said back then in 93. Yes, it's wonderful, but now it's going to be overused. And it was like a young adolescent girl, right, who had just discovered makeup, and she's turned into a harlot overnight. Right. And that's what I felt about it. It was being treated irresponsibly, and it was going to get overused and metastasize into something where, you look like what Ridley Scott did with Alien. Okay. It was shot on 5700 stock Kodak. Okay. Technicolor. Right. He never shows you the full creature. Right. He shows you bits of the creature. So we essentially were raping imagination with these things where he's showing 10-second shots. Right. And remember, there's only 50 shots in Jurassic. Right. But the next had like thousands in it. Right. And what suffers is the story. And guys like Ridley Scott, the pace of the film, all these things, great movie making techniques like pace, the beautiful pace from the beginning opening credits alone, and then things begin, the frequency increases and the intensity increases, so those things were all abandoned, and I felt in a lot of ways that Spielberg had deviated from his traditional storytelling methodology, where he does background character development. If you look at Jaws, the backstories were so beautiful, and it seemed to be sort of it seemed to be kind of candy coated a little bit with Jurassic. It was almost over advertised, in a way. And everyone's, oh, it's so wonderful. But comparatively, you know, you look at Jurassic and you look at some of the techniques that Dean Cundy used, because everyone was learning back then. You couldn't really move the camera that much, you know, and so they're learning, you know. But now, once you can move the camera and you can change, basically, you're taking the amalgam of video game mentality and movie mentality and congealing them. And now you really don't have a movie, right? You have an advertising pamphlet, right, for a video game. Right. And it's just all over the bloody map, in my view.
Yeah. It's interesting what you say about the, you know, it kind of ruining the story. Somebody did a graph once, and I still can't find it to this day. It was about 15 years ago. Somebody did a graph of how many minutes into the movie the monster was revealed. So like you've got Alien, it's like 57 minutes. And then you fast forward to Cloverfield and it's like 9 minutes or something. You know?
It's absolutely terrific because, you know, as again, I go back to Ridley Scott, you know, because what he does is he kind of, you know, he creates a willing suspension of disbelief, right? So your imagination is within the film itself as controlled by his storytelling methodology, right? So when he introduces little bits, your imagination is going into overdrive. Whereas as opposed to like an ice pick to your eye, to your point about the creature booms in your face for 10 seconds, you know, and all of a sudden you become desensitized. It's like digital fentanyl. You want more.
Yeah. There's bits in Alien where you think, did I just see the monster or did I see a pipe or is it part of the ship? You know, fantastic. Now we just see full frame. You know, I actually, you know, even Jurassic Park can be kind of, you know, celebrated from, you know, that T-Rex shot when it first comes out. You don't see the whole T-Rex. You see it in stages.
Very good. It was very good. And it's like he did with the Jaws creature and stuff. But you know, these are Spielberg moments. What, you know, the oscillation of the water, right? I mean, that stuff really sets up your imagination. But in my view, that's really the only time it really comes together. I think people flipped out at the kitchen sequence, which I animated half those shots. Yeah. Also clarifies something else in terms of the technique that was used. They talk about the DID. We call it the didn't because it didn't work. Okay, and it was only responsible for 4 shots of the 50. Me and Armstrong animated the majority of them.
Is that right?
Okay. The problem with the DID is that it had potentiometers along a spine and it had plugged in a RS-232 SCSI port in the back of a 420 Indigo. So the thing is, the potentiometers were too large to get to the knees and the ankles and the toes especially. And Phil, not knowing technology, had insisted on animating on ones. So we would get this spiky data. So we run a smoothing algorithm over it. Still didn't work, and it wasn't right. But Randy Dutra's poses were fantastic, right? So what Armstrong and I did throughout all the data for the 4 shots only that DID was used for, only 4 shots of the 50.
Just a quick interjection here. Former guest Alexandra Ponset contacted me to say that Randy Dutra did 3 T-Rex shots in the T-Rex escape scene. There were also a number of shots done in the kitchen scene using the DID. So there are between 15 and 20 DID shots in the film, Alexandra has found. In speaking to these animators, it says the animation done at ILM was directly supervised by Phil Tippett, who taught the animators how to create movement for the dinosaurs with stop motion armatures. It's all in their book about Phil Tippett. Anyway, you can find out on Twitter. There's a response to my posting of this podcast from Alexandra with some more of the details. And now back to my conversation with Steve Williams and director Scott Lieberich.
Even though they plug it as being responsible, I know Mirren does. Well, Phil said no. That's
been part of the whole story of Jurassic Park from the beginning. But it's this amalgam of new technology and old technology, and Phil's ability to animate and understand animals and all that kind of stuff.
It's complete and utter poppycock. Okay,
it's even in the museum, right? It's in the Academy Museum in a cabinet.
It's a joke. Okay, it handled 4 shots and they had to be cleaned up, and then we had to reanimate personally, right, the legs. to handle those walking shots. The only thing we got were A and B poses from Dutra for 4 shots, right? 3 Rexes and 1 Raptor and 2 Raptors. That's it. So that's why we call it the didn't, because it didn't work. And I know I've seen interviews where they're talking about it. Well, you know, we use that to input. That is the biggest bloody fallacy in the world. I personally, I mean, how are you going to take the DID and make it run from A to B across a room with wires hooked onto it? You know, so I had to figure out the run, you know, and that's all hand done, you know, as with the Brachios and Parasaurolophus and the majority of the Raptors. You know, so I'm sorry, you know, I'm sorry to sort of, you know, pop the bubble of, you know, viewers, right, or listeners and stuff like that, but it's not the case, and that's coming from the horse's mouth.
But these things get mythologized, don't you? You know, you're talking about Jaws a moment ago, and there's that whole story that the yellow barrels were invented because the shark wasn't ready. Like, I've spoken to Joe Alves, the production designer. They got every single shot they wanted with that shark. Yes, there were delays because they didn't give them enough time to make it. But you end up with these kind of movie myths, don't you? And
you do, and see, that's a part of the whole process, is that people want to know what's behind, underneath the hood for these stories and stuff like that. Is that, how did this come to be? Well, you didn't realize this. Like, you know, I'll tell you, true myths is that the guy who gets it off the toilet seat in Jurassic, I animated that shot. That's the T1000 data that I repurposed because we didn't have any human data. So I just took the original data that I had built in Alias for Terminator. First shot I had to do was walking out of the fire. It took me 4 months to animate that shot, 6 months. It was all forward kinematic system. It wasn't an inverse kinematic system at that time. It was Alias version 2.4.1. And then for Jurassic, we went to Softimage version 2.6.2, right? Which was an inverse kinematic system. We could have never done the production without that.
You really do have a fantastic memory for this stuff. And I'm sure I've got quite a few effects guys listen to this podcast. They're going to be geeking out with that information.
And you know, and inverse kinematics, we could not, the first bone test that I had done, that I ambushed all of them, you know, and it was an ambush, and it was all forward kinematic shot in Alias 2. We did not have SI in yet. And so Softimage came in and did a demo, and they showed me some fundamentals, and I picked it up right away, and I ordered 30 licenses right then, you know, and we couldn't have done Jurassic without it. There's no way. And now the international standard, of course, is inverse kinematic. You know, where one effector is pulled as opposed to rotating a pivot, and setting 3 keyframes for the animation. It was one effector, right, in 3-dimensional space, X, Y, Z, right, where you move it around, it would modify the data, you know, so it was one channel of animation. It became very powerful and essential. Get Dennis to explain that.
Scott, when you embarked upon making this movie, this documentary, how much responsibility did you feel towards Steve in painting him in a way that, you know, is interesting and entertaining to an audience and insightful, but at the same time, you know, kind of honoring Steve's story?
It wasn't really, the story is so sensational already to me. Like, it's already one of those like stranger than fiction stories where I actually almost never had that feeling of like, I'm gonna, you know, do something here that is, you know, exaggerating or
manipulative
or manipulative or anything. Cause the stories are sometimes so wild that what was really helpful were some of my other subjects like John Schlag and Mike Notkin and Stefan Fangmeyer and Mark DePay, all very, you know, sort of the straight men of the story who are going to just, and basically whenever I would think, wow, this is almost hard to believe. It's almost like crazy what happened. I would always make sure and ask them, those guys, like, is this what happened? And they would all corroborate the stories. And so like, that
was the thing, Jamie, and because, you know, those guys and I, we were the main core of that thing. So they saw it all come down. And so I thought, if Scott wants to tell the truth, I'm going to, as I said before, I said, you know, if this is going to be a documentary that has migrated into being about me, I thought, you're going to get the truth about everything. And because, you know, I try to make a policy, you know, with my work to try and tell the truth about what I thought, regardless of taking arrows in the back. And so I thought if he does a documentary, I just knew that not one of those guys, the adversarials, right, would ever have the balls, right, essentially, right, and to actually tell the story of what's under the hood. And I thought there's nothing more pure than that, right? So
yeah. At the start of the film, you have the Netflix guys from the movies that made us visit you. And how concerned were you, Scott, that your story was kind of going to be told? I mean, in a much shorter form, but did it concern you at any point?
Yeah, there was definitely. I was, when Steve called to tell me, "Hey, I just got a call from Netflix," I was like, "Don't do it, please, don't do it. They're gonna scoop me. They're gonna scoop me."
I got all nervous.
So he had to talk me down, but I was really upset. Like I was really like, fuck, this thing I've been working on for so many years is going to get told by this Netflix show. And then, Light and Magic came out, and I was like, it's going to happen again. But in the end, both those things have sort of laid the groundwork for, I think, Jurassic Punk in terms of, bringing Steve's story out in a more broad sense in terms of how he fit into this big puzzle. But then my story is like, well, let's take that guy and let's tell his story, just this one guy. And so
you want to see what's underneath the hood. And I know Scotty was very concerned about it, but I said, Scott, it's going to work out because people are going to start asking questions. Okay, this looks all fluffy and nice, but what's underneath the hood? And you have something in the can that's going to answer that question, right? And there's no spinning of anything that's going on. Larry Kazan, when he did Light and Magic, was intent on getting the truth. Because even for the interview, I said, Larry, do you want the Cole's Notes version or do you want exactly what happened? And I talked to his executive producers, and he said he is intent on getting the truth out because, they were a little soft on the Abyss stuff, all the stuff I'd done on the Abyss, but I didn't really care. But I felt he told as much of a truth as he can do when in fact his paycheck was coming from Disney.
Yeah.
At that. So
yeah.
Ironically.
Yeah, it is one of the things that cut sort of scenes from my film is a little detail about the Pixar sale to Steve Jobs. Mm-hmm. So what's kind of fascinating about that detail is that literally happened the year before Steve and Mark were hired, and all these new guys started coming in, and they wanted to rebuild that department. And so to me, it's kind of fascinating that like part of it was the fact that this older group, the Pixar group, had left, and then they had to bring in new people, and that was these guys that my story is about, or my movie's about.
Mm-hmm. How has the film been received? I see you've taken it to South by Southwest, and it's won the Grand Jury Prize, and to the Sitges Festival in Barcelona, and won Best Documentary. Like, is it been good the whole time you've been showing this to people? Has it been received well?
Yeah, pretty well. I mean, it didn't actually, just to correct you, it didn't win a Grand Jury Prize. It was nominated for a Grand Jury Prize, but they only nominate 10 films, so it's kind of a cool thing. But yeah, it did win Sitges documentary, Best Documentary. So yeah, generally, like, people who come to the festivals to see the film will come up and talk to me and thank me for telling the story, and are just kind of blown away. They just never. They're fans of the Jurassic Park. They're fans of visual effects, and to know really in a lot of detail Steve's story is kind of mind blowing for a lot of people so far.
From the sort of creation point of view of it and the selling of the documentary, did you finish the documentary before you sold it, or have you not sold it, or what's the current status with it?
Oh, it's sold, and it's being distributed by Gravitas Ventures, and it's going to be released on December 16th on many platforms. Yeah.
And had you got it to kind of a very nearly finished point, or a finished point, before you tried to sell it?
Oh yes, yeah. I mean, submitting to South by Southwest, you want it to be as finished as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And
when was that? Like, that would have been like March.
That was March. Yeah. So now between March and the sale, I made some tweaks. The thing about this process is, like, as a filmmaker, you're kind of working in a bubble the whole time until you show your film to people and you find out. So I had many screenings with friends and trusted people along the way, but you learn something each time. And so South by Southwest was great, and it was a learning experience where I was able to make a few more little tweaks to the film before the final release, which is what's coming out in a couple of weeks.
And you're only going to get so far with friends and trusted colleagues, and because they're loyal people, right? But once you get this in front of an audience, I guess that's the first time you get a real feeling on how it's landing. And
Jamie, that's another thing I'd sort of interject about. The thing is that I want to be very clear about this. At the days of ILM, we were all friends. We all got along. We all had we were very young. We had a common goal, right? And so I always felt that, because I was intimately involved with every one of the people that I work with, right? They're buddies. We hung out together. We had a blast together on the weekends, and it was fun. Now, I tried that with Dennis, and he did not want to be my friend. I really tried. So this was not a malicious thing that I went about. And I tried with these guys, but they were in a different category than me. They were on that sort of political eyes on the prize thing. And that's what DePay always said. You just got to understand, with these guys, they got their eyes on the prize. And I never did. The prize was for me, it was accomplishment. And there was nothing worse than finishing a shot, nothing worse. Right? Like, you have no more empires to conquer, right? And it was horrible. When Jurassic finished, I had no more problem solving to do. And then we spun off horizontally to do things like The Mask, right? And then Jumanji and all these other things that weren't really a challenge that much. Yes, they were fun, but they were sort of a lateral move in terms of innovation.
You were still using the technology that you created already. You weren't pushing forward with it.
And God, there was nothing worse than not being challenged anymore. It was terrible, and it never really stopped after that time, But as I said, I remain very close friends with all those guys that are in that interview. But I tried with the Illuminati of ILM, and I was not accepted into that club, and I knew I just didn't fit in. So I thought, what, I'm far more comfortable in the trench, right, of actually doing the work myself, right. Even though I ended up supervising some stuff, but it was far more comfortable for me and honest, and that's one of the reasons why the documentary was important, because it had to be honest. It had to show the highs and the lows and all the warts.
And have you heard from any of those guys that are kind of outside your group, whether they've seen the film or what they think about the film or what they're expecting even?
Well, I've heard a lot, James Cameron, right, remains a friend, and he saw the original 20, was blown away. He wrote us a 2-page letter on it and loved it.
Nice.
Thanks. And he's, basically very busy with his next venture right now. I'm sure he has a lot of trepidation right now, but it got so bad, actually, Jamie, is that, so ILM had their 40th anniversary at the old stage. And this is a year ago last summer, and I was still in California at the time. And I was supposed to go. Then I got an email. Then the Netflix thing came out. Then I got an email saying that there's been a change in plans. It's been asked that you do not show up at the party, right? And there's some very high profile people that don't want you. I thought, what does this mean? I said, I feel bad for her because she was a friend, because she was basically deputized to do the dirty work for these fucking cowards, right? And that's what pissed me off. I sent that to Cameron. He couldn't believe it, right? Yeah. And so this is the type of thing. It's like, is it perpetuating this bad boy thing? I didn't try. Yeah, I'm a former semi-pro hockey player, and I played rugby for Ontario for years. So, and I look like a gorilla more than I look like a computer guy. And then so it's kind of like, well, please don't show up because we don't want any conflicts at the door. So what do you think I'm going to get? I'm not a violent man, I use cartoons as fists, right? So.
When I think about, I haven't been to it yet, but the Academy Museum, like you were just talking about how the DID devices at the Academy Museum, I have a dream that the Academy will maybe someday make a part of their museum, or maybe a temporary exhibit, a recreation of the pit that people can actually walk into and stand in and be like, this is where it all happened, I think would be so cool, because there is so much documentation of that room, and they could totally recreate it.
So this is the room that you were in, just for people who haven't seen the film. So this is the room that you were in, Steve, working in the pit downstairs, no natural light. I think the worst thing you could do is render it in Unreal 5 or something, you know. Just
Unreal 5.
What do you think, like, looking at the state of effects currently? Let's just for a moment forget the issues we've already talked about in terms of, you know, people working these 70, 80-hour weeks, even more. I know a few people in effects, and they're all on the tip of crisis at all times. But what? Go on.
I think the next shift will be as such, and I've sort of said this years ago as well. I said, you know, they will come out, you know, because everyone's fiddling around with doing creatures, and you know it's fantasy. But what'll happen, right? It is be very much like a War of the World scenario, right? Where there's a broadcast that's on and they don't announce it, and people are literally committing suicide because they think that they're, you know, the aliens are attacking New York City. So what'll happen is that they'll come out with a movie, a rom-com, you know, kind of thing, with some famous people, and there'll be an actor in it, right? And they won't tell the public, you know, and the actor will go through, it'll have its run, you know, and streaming and all that, and they're going to, who is that actor? We haven't seen before. Oh, guess what? They don't exist. That's going to get the public.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
If in fact it hasn't happened already, you know, and these are warnings that I put forth. You know, if you don't have countries that have gone through an industrial scientific revolution and you have their president being beaten up by for an adversary, they're going to buy it. I think that is the weapon you're dealing with right now, in my view. And so, you know, with the whole AI, that's what I tell people. Like, guys, you know, AI already happened. It's called us. Okay, all we're doing is replicating our same neurology, right? Whether we like it or not, you know. And that's what I think will be sort of the next epiphany that happens when people are essentially, the public's going to be fooled. You know, it's like, it's the same thing. Like, people, when they're watching stuff down, they don't know if it's a real car wreck or a real explosion or real hair or real water, right? That will also extend into real humans, right? And I'm not saying it's right, Jamie. I'm just saying it's inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can tell you, I was I remember the day I realized that I can't believe anything I see in a two-dimensional medium anymore. And it was when I was at a conference that came a month after Jurassic Park was released in '93. And it was held in Hawaii, in Kauai. And Stan Winston was there, Phil Tippett was there, Gary Rydstrom, Dennis Murin. And
everybody but me.
Everybody but you and Mark. Yeah, exactly. And they were showing like how they made the movie. And the dinosaurs, of course, were stunning. But then they started to break down the shot where the T-Rex steps on the Jeep. And when they said that Jeep is not real, that's a CG Jeep. It was the Jeep that blew my mind. It was that you would have never thought that was a piece of computer graphics as well. And when that happened, I was like, it's over. Like, the time of us believing anything presented in a two-dimensional medium is over. It's like, it could be anything.
But, you know, Jamie, people forget that the sort of primary function of three-dimensional software, that type of software, that was the intent was to do industrial design, right? And so in the early days of Alias, long before the ILM days, in the mid 80s and stuff, there was the ID market and the VA market, the industrial design market and the video animation market. And I was starting to see some of my people around, we were trying to do organic animation with this thing, but the intention was from numeric control milling, right? And to do hard surface modeling. Right. So, you know, it's interesting. I animated that shot too. And so what Scott's revelation was the odd thing, which was a complete recycle of what the intention for that type of software was. It was not intended for organic creatures, which is really interesting.
It is. And it's, you know, I was thinking as you were saying that, it's those things that you look past, because obviously the focus at the time, the press was very driven by, if we don't buy that first shot, you know, of the Brachiosaurus, that was always the line, wasn't it? The movie was going to fail. But it's those little things you look past. I think it was when I saw Zodiac, and I didn't realize they kind of re-rendered all of those backgrounds of San Francisco. Like,
No, I know. And it's just like I said, any image on it's like the bathtub with color ball bearings, every single one of them is addressable. And that was I stood on when I wrote it 45 years ago.
Yeah.
I still writing, yeah. And everyone thought I was nuts. And I remember, just as another thing to do with the VA market versus, I'm sort of taking a history, taking a jump back in history, but tension for that software, early Alias version 2, which is a B-spline modeler. This is pre-subdiv, right? So it's four-sided, patches, right, that had to have complementary control vertices, which, today, a creature would be completely built differently. But when I built the T1000 and the Rex, they're essentially four-sided sheets of paper that had to all be complementary in terms of control vertice numbers. And then the control vertices had to be addressed manually, right, in order to have the correct weight and attention on the actual kinematic chain, which they call rigging now. Don't ask me why, but it used to be called chaining. I remember at Alias, there was a vice president. I have said, you know what, I'm gonna leave Alias now because I'm getting all this freelance work, and it was great because no one really did it. And so the vice president at the time was a guy named Art Bell. He got right into my face. And he goes, I don't know why you're pursuing this video animation thing. The VA market is dead. It's dead. It's never going to happen. And so what I'm saying is that this was not the first time that I ran into an adversarial because I had a different opinion about things, right? And I never expected it at ILM, kind of thing. But that's.
But the question I was about to ask about computer effects artists today is not what the next thing is going to be. But what is it that computer effects artists have still not figured out with the technology, Because I think we've got to a point now where I see CGI and the use of CGI as the color beige at the moment. It's just kind of, it's the same. We've talked about these films that you worked on. You think about The Abyss and it's this huge peak. And then T2 is a huge peak in Jurassic Park. I feel like it's kind of settled into this kind of homogenous lump.
I think you're going to see, they said that movies would destroy the theater, but all it did was force actors to hone their skill. And I think the same thing that'll happen with CG, that people are going to get so desensitized by it, they'll probably go to some form of stop motion, right? Case in point, a while ago, everyone's so used to the CG Yoda, okay, I mean, George Lucas had asked me if I could build it, and I thought, why, kind of thing, and then all of a sudden Empire came on, right? Not too long, about 2 years ago, this happened, and I saw the puppeteered version by Frank Oz. It was unbelievable for me, right? And it lacked a cleanness, and it gave your imagination a job. So hopefully there's a resurrection for CGR. So what does that translate to? Be able to draw, be able to work with your hands. Like every time I interview an animator, like Jeffy Campbell or all those guys, I didn't care about their reels because I knew they could handle the work. I asked about what they did, right? Ancillary, right, to that. Do they like garlic? How much do they weigh? Do they play with clay? Have you ever welded before? Do you play an? Because all those types of things about their foundation got injected into the character ultimately. So to me, it was more important that they had these backup setups, kind of thing, prior to function key 7 for a walk cycle now, So
yeah, I would echo that because I feel like the technology is finally settling, maybe in a way, even though there are still advances every year. The technology is, and you have directors now who their entire careers have been utilizing visual effects, computer visual effects. And so it's become a real, just one of the paintbrushes in a lot of filmmakers' toolboxes. So like you said about beige, it does feel that way. So now what's left? Probably it's just the way you use it, and using it in a way that, again, maybe tells the story in a different way. Even though you're using computer graphics, you're using it in a different way. And that's like any editor trick or cinematography trick. It's you have a handful of them. But what really makes, even like when you think about cooking or a chef cooking, everybody has the same amount of ingredients. Everybody has the same kind of ingredients, but it's how you mix them up is how you make a great dish. And so, like, to me right now, that's where we're at. I don't know when we're going to see another breakthrough like like what happened in 1993 in that era, because that was like similar to, you know, what happened with Willis O'Brien and King Kong in the 1930s and early 30s in 1933. And so we have like another few decades probably before something really new happens.
But you have to look at this, you know, Jamie, in a way, as being a building block to the inevitable. You know, when you look at the cave paintings, right, but Neanderthal man and Pithecanthropus and Cro-Magnon, when somebody was painting on the side of the wall in blood and berries, that was not art. Okay, that was considered a story of reality at that time. And it wasn't until the Italian frescoes come along and you add religion to that, all of a sudden the cave paintings become art or expressionism. And then Lumiere comes along, lays looms, and starts transferring this new science kind of thing, which was reality, you know, and the Italian frescoes become expressionism or art, and so on and so on. Like when Scorsese did Raging Bull. Now, there was great color stock out of that time, but he shot in black and white, right? So he took a step back, right? And it actually was a great re-education, right, for the memory to actually look at it and to reestablish the fact that you have to use your imagination to fill in these blanks because of the willing suspension of disbelief, such as the Willis O'Briens. So what's happening now, you know, you have, I mean, with the technology and everything, you look at companies like Neuralink and all this, and this slow merging of all these things, you eventually will be watching movies in your head. Sound familiar? You know, and that perception of reality and the control ability, and I know it sounds all conspiratorial, right? But the ability is literally to watch movies in your head will happen, right? I'm not saying it's right. It's just the way it is. When they tap the optical cortex, you know, so that's where things are going to get crazy. That's why humans love drugs, right? Is because it changes their perception of reality, and so do movies. So why not put the movies in your skull? Now, I'm not saying it's right, but that's what's happening. So that's where the sort of the storytelling methodology of a video game, which is first-person control, or avatars, first-person control, as opposed to a movie, which is carved in granite to some degree in terms of the finished, dried result. You know, that's where the storyteller will have the control over controlling the individual. But if you have the ability to be in the movie and actually alter it, okay, as an internal process, of which we're already baby stepping to that right now with controllers. That's what I think is going to happen. And that's where it's going to get really scary. But scary is always relative. You got to remember, like, Tournier or Da Vinci's painting, Michelangelo's painting of David, you know, in the heavens. I mean, and those cathedrals, okay, those were the THX theaters at the time, and that was Star Wars, and that was reality, right? And if you differed with it, okay, you were a heretic. It's like the religion of Star Wars. I mean, you literally have people believing it's real, right? I call it the book of Star Wars, you know, because when Star Wars came out in the 70s, no one was going to church, right? So no one knew about good and evil. They were being taught good and evil from a movie franchise. And it's still that way today. It's insane. You know? So.
But I think, you know, that crossing that threshold where people aren't sure whether they're seeing or hearing reality, you know, with the AI stuff, the deep fake, the voice replication, virtual reality, all these things, like you say, are sort of kind of melding together. We're just getting to a point where you can't believe anything you've seen or heard. And that is quite a frightening prospect.
It is. But, you know, you have to understand it's still relative, though. Your grandparents, as soon as a telephone came into the house or a TV came into the house, that was alien. And you got to remember, scientific industrial revolution was not around that long ago. So all these innovations that have happened have been within the last 100 years, you know, even though the Earth is 4.5 billion, right? And we theoretically migrated from the Serengeti 250,000 years ago, right? And all this, but, you know, the universe is 13.8 billion years. You know, there's 500 billion planets in this galaxy. It's all happened before, and it's all going to happen again.
That's a great cut point, I think, for the end there. That was great. I enjoyed that. One last thing, actually, I should just ask you to reiterate where people can see the movie. So where can people watch Jurassic Punk, and just remind us of where and when they can do that?
So Jurassic Punk is going to be coming out on December 16th. You can pre-order it now on iTunes. It's going to be also available on Amazon Prime, Comcast, Spectrum, Vudu, all the the streaming platforms. And it will be having a theatrical release in a couple cities. We don't have the actual cities yet or the screening times yet, but that information is coming.
All right, Jamie, it's a pleasure.
Yeah, good to meet you guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Cheers, guys. Take care. All the best.
Bye.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my chat there with Steve and Scott. Thanks to both of them for their time, and I wish them well for the documentary and for the future. Next up, I'm speaking with Rose Dugnan, who is a long-time employee of ILM. You will have seen her if you recently watched Light and Magic on Disney+. Again, I'm looking forward to her unique perspective on all the ILM stories I've covered throughout my many episodes of this podcast. This podcast is not just about that, but there's been it's fairly heavily weighted towards people that work for ILM over the years in recent episodes. I'm also tonight interviewing Patrick Reed Johnston, who's made a film about his love of movies. It's a semi-autobiographical film. I think it says at the top of the movie, most of this is true. It's called 5/25/77, and I'll be chatting to him soon, and that'll be an upcoming episode as well. I've also just started speaking with Lee Unkrich, who is a movie director, but also is an obsessive of The Shining, and he's finally releasing his book or books about The Shining with Taschen, and he's going to come on and tell us all about that. So I'm really looking forward to that one. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you can do so again for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.